when faced with the stone of God punishments. He then demanded that they hand over the medicine. Isabella sighed, looking at the expressions of the two women. Anpian, completely provoked by their nonchalant attitudes, watched as his guards, armed with shields embedded with the stone of God punishments, advanced toward the two witches. However, before they could reach them, the guards suddenly turned their swords on themselves, slicing into their own necks. Blood splattered as the guards fell one after another. Prince Anpian was trembling uncontrollably as if he had witnessed something utterly horrifying. The momentum and fury that had fueled him just moments ago drained away rapidly. Soon after, a wet patch appeared in the middle of his trousers as he lost control of his bladder, with urine trickling down his legs. Black Veil steadily approached the prince, step by step. Otto and Oro, hidden in the secret chamber, were eager to rush out, but the mechanisms to open it could only be operated from inside the room. Isabella suggested not to take things too far. With a snap of her fingers, Black Veil intending to give the prince a lesson, he suddenly seemed to snap out of a trance and sat down on the ground, shivering and scooting backward. He asked, confused, even with all these stone of God punishments. Anpian stuttered out a question, wondering how the two witches could possibly still use their powers. Isabella smiled faintly, explaining that it was because they were the pure ones. Isabella then suggested that the prince should adhere to their agreement earnestly. His father would eventually be safe and sound, and once the church took over Grey Castle, the prince could become one of them. Even if the Kingdom of Dawn is taken over by the church, the prince can still enjoy a life of wealth and comfort. His people can be spared from the suffering of war. Why bother making these foolish moves now? As she left the room, she turned back and added, the prince should clean up this place. The king will wake up soon, and he probably wouldn't want to see his bedroom in such a state. Otto felt his back soaked with cold sweat. The pure ones, who were not afraid of the stone of God's punishments, along with the church's plan to first conquer Grey Castle and then take over the Kingdom of Dawn, all sent chills down his spine. The church has long seen the four great kingdoms as meat in their mouths. This is exactly what His Majesty Roland said. Oro wondered aloud what they should do. Oro thought this was way beyond what they can handle. They must inform their father and Lord Quinn. However, Otto was skeptical. What good will tell them to do? They are dealing with people who are not even afraid of stone of God punishments. Otto closed his eyes and said, he knows someone who can deal with them. They need to go to the Grey Castle ambassador immediately and pass on what they've heard to His Majesty Roland Wimbledon. In the city of Neverwinter, in the border town, Roland was reading a reply letter from Duke Calvin with a smile. Nightingale appeared behind him and asked what he was laughing at. Roland found Duke Calvin's reply letter quite amusing. First, the Duke inquired about when Roland was going to hold the coronation ceremony so he could prepare to come and congratulate him. At the end of the letter, the Duke proposed a marriage alliance, praising his daughter Edith's beauty and talent on an entire page, claiming that she could handle both domestic and foreign affairs perfectly, making her the best queen candidate. Nightingale took the letter and frowned after reading a few lines. She then turned around asking Roland isn't going to agree, right? Roland, of course, had no intention of agreeing. Jockling said if Edith is really as outstanding as the letter describes, he'd be afraid to let her into the castle. Of course, this was a joke. Roland did not need a political marriage to stabilize his throne. Nightingale sighed in relief because she knew Roland was telling the truth. Suddenly, a flying messenger bird flew through the open window and landed on the desk. It was a secret letter from the old capital, indicating that there was news from the City of Dawn. Roland fed the bird some fish jerky and opened the confidential letter. It seems Ambassador York is quite competent, he commented. However, his expression changed abruptly as he read the letter. The first sentence of the letter gave him a big shock. The Dawn Palace has been infiltrated by the Pure One. Their abilities can ignore Stone of God punishments. The Crown Prince tried to resist, but the guards, under the control of the Pure One, committed suicide with their own swords. The church intends to attack Grey Castle first. Witnessing all this were Otto and Oro, and the three great families hoped to get Roland's help. After a while, the two of them watched the secret letter burn, feeling a heavy weight in their hearts. A witch immune to the effects of the Stone of God punishments. As far as they knew, only the extraordinary witches could achieve this. Apart from that, there were the high-ranking demons known as magic slayers. Roland took a deep breath, suddenly realizing that he had to make significant adjustments to his plan to reclaim the southern territory. Quickly, Roland convened a strategic discussion meeting in the castle's room. Axe suggested replacing the soldiers of the First Army stationed at Dragonfall Ridge with newly trained recruits, as they should have no problem dealing with those nobles. The First Army needed to be concentrated together to defend against the church. Roland agreed and turned to look at the map, realizing they were now facing two issues: first, when the enemy would attack, and second, where the enemy would start their attack. Roland roughly recounted the contents of the secret letter, wanting to hear everyone's suggestions. Barav spoke first, stating that no matter where they appeared, the enemy would first have to pass through the kingdom's northern territories, all of which were under the jurisdiction of Duke Calvin right now. He suggested letting Miss Edith deliver this message to her father. Edith stood up and said that while it was indeed necessary to dispatch people to monitor all of the possible routes, it didn't mean that was a good method. They needed to act quickly to buy enough time for Roland. Roland shifted his gaze towards Edith, who confidently responded, "Send people to Hermes." Carter frowned, displaying his concern and curiosity about Edith's plan. Carter expressed his doubts about the efficacy of sending people over to the holy city of the church, and Petrov added that it would be difficult to blend in since the local population is full of fanatic followers of the church. Edith smiled and explained that there was no need to enter the holy city, it would suffice to find merchants nearby and have a good chat with them. Edith slowly walked up to the front, her finger pointing towards the map as she spoke with a serious tone. "The terrain of Hermes is extremely unique, creating a gentle slope with its mountain ranges. The new holy city is situated atop a plateau, but the environment here is incredibly harsh. While the natural barriers can help the church fend off demonic beasts, this place itself is not suitable for living, let alone farming." Edith paused for a moment before continuing her explanation. "This means that they must rely on external resources, especially food. Every autumn, dozens of caravans from the four kingdoms arriving each day, all for the sole purpose of supplying the new holy city." She then concluded, "In other words, if the church planned to dispatch their army, the merchants would certainly notice. According to the changes in the scale of material transportation, they can then estimate the time of their deployment." Edith's tone was firm and displayed confidence, which was exceedingly rare among women of this era. Everyone in the room was surprised. Roland pondered inwardly. It seems that Calvin's description of Edith in his letter wasn't entirely an exaggeration. Edith expressed a deep interest in Roland's First Army's tactics, eager to understand how Roland's troops had managed to breach the old royal capital within a single day. She also hoped to learn through observation, aiming to better assist Roland in the upcoming battles. Roland agreed and instructed Axe to make the necessary arrangements. Sylvie's expression revealed her deep concerns. She believed this might be an exceptionally tough battle and suggested notifying Tilly, hoping that the witch from Slumbering Isle could lend Roland a helping hand. Roland couldn't help but smile bitterly upon hearing Sylvie's suggestion. The situation on Slumbering Isle was not much better than his own. There had been no news since Roland informed Tilly about the Blood Fong. If Tilly were to bring the witches to aid him without resolving the internal conflicts, Slumbering Isle might fall into greater turmoil. However, Roland also knew that going against the Pure Ones with their strange abilities, witches indeed provided the most effective countermeasure. Eventually, Roland nodded in agreement, saying that he will be writing a letter to Tilly. Agatha then offered her suggestion, advising that all soldiers of the First Army were the Stone of God punishments. She explained that throughout the hundreds of years of history in the Federation, there had been a few powerful witches with inconceivable abilities. Against such witches, ordinary people without Stone of God punishments were utterly powerless, and a single witch of that caliber could claim the lives of thousands. Barav raised a practical question, asking, where can they find so many Stone of God punishments all of a sudden? Roland responded, saying they could get them from the church. As he spoke, a cold smirk appeared on his face. It's time to uproot the enemy's power, just like breaking off a venomous snake's fangs. As night fell, Wendy gathered all the witches together in her bedroom. When everyone's attention was focused on her, she informed them that the church was on its way and recounted the details of the meeting. After a brief silence, Rem whispered her willingness to stay by the factory all day to provide Roland with electricity. Lily followed by gently pinching Rem's cheek, warmly reminding her, if she wears herself out, Roland will be more worried, and will have to send someone to take care of her. Their interaction elicited a round of light laughter, easing the tension in the room. Rem's initiative sparked a wave of responses from the other witches. Evelyn said she would produce as much alcohol as possible to contribute her part. The atmosphere in the room gradually became more positive. They were not overwhelmed by fear, but rather, they were preparing for battle. Seeing everyone's reaction, Wendy felt a slight relief in her heart. Although the witches had their concerns, none showed fear of battling the church, a scenario that was unimaginable a year ago. Taking a deep breath to quiet the room, Wendy spoke earnestly, telling everyone that this war is crucial for the future of the Witch Union. Asking them if they ever thought about what it would mean for them if His Majesty ultimately defeats the church. The room fell silent, but their eyes shimmered with an indescribable light. Wendy continued slowly, within the kingdom of Grey Castle, and perhaps across the entire continent, witches will be able to live in peace. Under His Majesty Roland's rule, they might even have the chance to create a new world alongside ordinary people, enjoying peace and equality. She added with a smile, of course, knowing His Majesty's usual style, he would probably prefer everyone to continue working as usual and not overworking. Though Wendy could not deliver a rousing speech to the soldiers like Roland, she shared her heartfelt thoughts with everyone. Finally, Wendy looked at each and everyone present and said sincerely, this is their common home, and it's a crucial moment to change their fate. She is willing to give her all for it. With that, she extended her hand, palm down, signaling everyone to pledge together. Scroll was the first to place her hand on Wendy's, followed by Nightingale and Anna. Agatha, gently pulled over by Leaf, hesitated for a moment before also placing her hand on top. The witches formed a circle, each one placing their hand on top of the others. Even the two previous Bloodfawn witches, Ithie and Shadowfeather, who had been hesitant, gathered their courage under everyone's smiling gaze and truly became a part of the group. Together, they shouted in unison, for the Witch Union, for King Roland, for the eternal Holy Mountain. Their voices were firm and powerful, echoing through the room. After everyone left, the bedroom gradually became silent, leaving only Wendy and Nightingale. Turning around, Wendy noticed that Nightingale had quietly opened the window and was standing there, her figure slightly melancholic under the moonlight. Slowly walking to her side, Wendy gently asked if Nightingale was also worried about the upcoming war. Nightingale took a deep breath, her voice low yet full of confidence. Nightingale has waited a long time to take revenge on the church. Perhaps other witch sisters who died unjustly at the hands of the church must also be looking forward to this day. Hearing Nightingale's words, a surge of deep emotions welled up in Wendy's heart. She reached out and gently touched Nightingale's face, holding her hands, looking into Nightingale's eyes, telling her to protect Roland, also remember to protect herself as well. Nightingale slowly closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of Wendy's touch, and tightly hugged her. Upon the issuance of the war order, the city of Neverwinter swiftly transitioned into a state of wartime preparedness, with everyone making urgent preparations for the upcoming battle. A large quantity of wheat from Dragon Fall Ridge was quickly transported to the granaries. Part of the wheat was processed into dry rations for the soldiers by hulling and milling. Firearms and ammunition were also being urgently prepared, and the new recruits had completed their basic training and were ready to engage in combat. Considering the moderate intensity of this operation, Roland decided to dispatch a force of 1,500 soldiers, commanded by Axe. Considering the possibility of encountering the Pure Ones, Sylvie and Ithie were also set to join the expedition. Brian approached, saying the location of the battle had not been decided. Roland wanted to hear the opinion of the First Army. Brian considered engaging within the Western Territory. This could leverage their firepower advantage and logistical support, with a massive amount of steamboats able to transport soldiers and ammunition to the front line in less than 1 day. As for the church, due to the long distance, if the war dragged on for more than a month, the church's forces would starve to death. However, Roland did not find this plan feasible, as the church still had significant influence in Greycastle, and a large number of believers could provide support to them. Edith shared her concerns, fearing that if the situation turned unfavorable, the church might force the citizens of Greycastle to consume the pills, using commoners to deplete the strength of the First Army. She is aware that Roland wants to win the war, while also ensuring the safety of the citizens of Greycastle. She suggested that the attack should be conducted outside the territory of Greycastle. Brian, however, believed that Edith lacked a sufficient understanding of firearms. He was worried that if the battle site was too far away and the ammunition was exhausted, logistical support could not be guaranteed, making it difficult to continue the war. Both of them hold different views and neither is able to persuade the other. Edith firmly believed that the civilians of Greycastle must be protected and spared from the ravages of war. Seeing their debate, Roland suggested why not concentrate the troops and supplies in advance to the border cities? Brian said they could not predict from which direction the church would launch their attack. Roland, however, analyzed from a strategic perspective, believing that they could guide the enemy to attack from the expected direction through a series of strategies. Seeing Roland pointing to the map, Edith suddenly mentioned the Coldwind Ridge. Roland nodded, suggesting that they could concentrate supplies in Coldwind Ridge and station the First Army in the nearby town of Misty Valley. This would force the church to attack from this direction. Brian asked in confusion. Edith explained that Coldwind Ridge was very close to the Holy City, and by concentrating their forces there, they could create an illusion for the church, making them believe that an offensive was imminent, thereby forcing the church to concentrate its forces there and achieving the goal of guiding the enemy's direction of attack. Brian raised another concern: what if the church chose not to attack from Coldwind Ridge? Roland responded calmly, then the Hermes holy city will be razed to the ground. Surrounded by raging flames, Anna watched in panic. The red fire devoured everything around her, and the scalding air stung her skin as flames danced chaotically. Thick smoke rolled below the ceiling, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Anna wanted to help but found herself powerless. She could hear screams from inside the house, while neighbors rushed to fight the fire. Suddenly, a man approached her, his gaze stern as he questioned Anna about the whereabouts of her mother and brother. Instead of offering comfort, he roughly grabbed her shoulders, slapping her face repeatedly. The pain and fear jolted Anna awake, and she found herself in bed, gasping for breath. The harsh scolding seemed to echo in her ears, lingering. Anna tried to calm herself, quickly gulping down a glass of cold water from her bedside table. Her breathing steadied as she dressed and freshened up before heading to the witch's building. Upon arriving, Ling waved and greeted her warmly, while Wendy complimented the beautiful weather and asked if Anna planned to visit North Slope Mountain. Anna exchanged brief greetings, saying she would be heading there later this afternoon. When the two jokingly asked if she was planning to go on a date with Roland, Anna smiled and simply shook her head, not elaborating further. Wendy didn't press further. Wendy handed Anna 2 gold coins. This was her salary for the month. With her payment in hand, Anna returned to the castle's main hall, where Carter was waiting. She handed one of the coins to him. Carter asked if it was the usual arrangement. Anna nodded. During the renovation of the border town, all the original residents, including Anna's father, were allocated a house. However, since he sold Anna to the church for 25 gold, she had cut all ties with this man. Despite this, there were some matters Anna could not completely avoid. The gold in her hand, for example. Her father, due to gambling, fraud, and theft, had exhausted his money in just half a year, falling into abject poverty. Carter approached a dilapidated room and knocked on the door. A man opened the door, smiling broadly as he invited Carter in for tea. However, Carter shook his head, his expression serious and a glimpse of disgust as he handed over the money, explaining it was the man's living expenses for the month. Meanwhile, Anna leaned against the hallway wall, sighing softly to herself, feeling that she could not burden Roland any further. When Carter returned, he patted his chest, assuring Anna that everything was taken care of. Anna sincerely thanked Carter, asking him not to tell Roland about it. Carter nodded in understanding. Anna then turned and walked down the stairs. After nearly 4 months, Lien set foot in the border town once again. Noticed the town had undergone drastic changes, the population had increased and the atmosphere was more lively. Lien and Honey rushed to the riverbank, diving straight into a day of hard work. When the last massive stone finally settled firmly into the ground, Lien wiped the sweat from her forehead. Honey clapped her hands in admiration, exclaiming, Lien had managed to carve a path through the mountain. Lien responded with a proud smile, there's nothing she can't do. After the work was finished, Honey asked if Lien had brought any fire-starting tools, suggesting they could catch fish and have a barbecue right here. However, Lien shook her head, saying she had enough of grilled fish on Slumbering Isle. Although Honey still seemed tempted by the idea of fish, Lien informed her that she shouldn't try fish here either, and Lien thought Roland might not appreciate the taste of salted fish either. Suddenly, Lien thought of Ash, wondering if she was still frequently troubled by various fish soups on Slumbering Isle. Lien's gaze swept over the future port construction site, thinking that soon they would be able to welcome Tilly here. Honey was happy to hear Tilly would also be here helping Roland with the upcoming war. Looking at the innocent Honey, Lien thought to herself, this child really knows nothing about war. If Tilly can't solve the issue with the Bloodfang back on Slumbering Isle and the church launches a full-scale attack on Roland, that would be real trouble. Still, she hoped that Tilly and everyone else could come back to the border town and, preferably, stay here forever. That way, the wish she made during winter could come true. On the bustling docks, everything was proceeding according to plan and in an orderly fashion. 1,500 First Army soldiers participating in the upcoming operation were boarding the warships, ready to set sail. Meanwhile, in accordance with the plan confirmed at the strategic meeting, an additional 4,000 soldiers from the First Army were transporting ammunition and food, preparing to head to the Northern Territories. Edith had promised to personally write a letter to her father, providing half of the warehouse stock for the soldiers' use, and said the Lord of the Misty Valley town had also stated that he would fully support all the needs of the First Army. Looking at the busy docks, Roland asked Edith if she had any plans to return to the north. Edith shook her head, expressing her preference to accompany the First Army and participate in all upcoming battles. She stood by the ship's rail, gently lifting her long hair, then made a gesture of respect, asking Roland to take care of her younger brother. Roland nodded in agreement, promising to take good care of Cole. The sea breeze gently lifted Edith's long hair. She looked deeply at Roland, telling him that when the Great War came, she would wait for him in Misty Valley Town. As the ship gradually sailed away, Nightingale couldn't help but express her discontent, thinking that Edith was treating this life-and-death situation as if arranging a romantic date with a lover. Roland felt a bit awkward, realizing that Nightingale still had some grudges from the letter Duke Calvin had sent. He asked Nightingale about the reliability of what Edith had just said. Reluctantly, Nightingale nodded, confirming that Edith was truthful both in expressing her loyalty to Roland and in discussing the battle plans. Roland breathed a sigh of relief, feeling reassured. He gently held onto Nightingale's hand, and the two of them returned to the castle together. Roland gazed pensively at the map, realizing that they would have another port built very soon. Next, they would need to start building houses, warehouses, and a temporary dock. Not long after, Maisie hurried into the office while pecking the window, holding a sealed letter. Roland quickly opened the letter, his eyes swiftly scanning every word in the letter. He fell into deep thought and then gave Maisie an order, bring Sylvie along and then catch up with the fleet as quickly as possible. Also, tell Effie to act according to the plan. Meanwhile, the fleet had arrived at the suburban docks by the Crimson Water City, causing a stir. The guards returned to the city gates were tightly shut, and the drawbridge over the moat was raised. Seeing this, Brian asked if they should blast the city gate open. Axe shook his head, indicating that their target was solely the church. They did not wish to make enemies with the local lords and decided to first go through diplomatic procedures, submitting the relevant documents. Edith stepped forward, volunteering to be the envoy. As the Duke's daughter, she is more than qualified to be the envoy. Brian expressed his concerns for her safety, and Axe decided to dispatch a squad of soldiers to accompany her. Axe then said that if a conflict arose, they would attack at all costs. Edith and the soldiers went to the city gate together and submitted their credentials. After a tense half-hour wait, the city gates finally opened slowly, and the drawbridge was lowered. A chubby middle-aged man came out. He was the Lord of Crimson Water City. He warmly invited everyone into the city, while Axe directly addressed the issue, mentioning the church's treasonous actions as well as the tragedies in the two other kingdoms. The Lord nodded, but his gaze unconsciously lingered on Edith. He then invited everyone to join him in an evening banquet. Brian was prepared to politely decline the invitation to a banquet, but he found that Edith had already accepted and stated that they would attend. However, they would need to complete their mission assigned by King Roland first. As the first army marched into the city in a neat formation under the guidance of the knights, suddenly, a commotion and the sound of stones hitting the ground broke the silence. Axe immediately raised his arm, giving the command, "All troops, be on guard." The soldiers quickly took out their weapons, ready for battle. Just then, Maisie and Sylvie rushed over in a hurry, shouting that there was a magical reaction ahead. Brian shouted urgently, telling the chubby lord to have his knights quickly get out of the way. But before he could finish his sentence, a group of church believers dressed in black robes charged out from around the corner, attacking the guiding knights. The impact of the attackers was astonishing. Even the horses were knocked down by their charge. The knights quickly engaged in battles with the attackers. The chubby lord was initially stunned by this sudden scene, but then he became furious, shouting loudly, "Damn it, eliminate all these rebels." However, a massive rock dropped from the sky made him quickly shut his mouth. Everyone then saw a woman with green hair using her magic to control the massive stones on the ground, hurling them at the knights like bullets. Seeing this, Axe immediately ordered to open fire. Continuous gunfire echoed through the streets, and bullets poured down like raindrops, hitting the witch. As the witch fell to the ground, the chubby lord, still somewhat in shock, saw the witch on the ground. Although he had heard the church was raising witches, now, having witnessed with his own eyes, he was in disbelief. Axe didn't pay him any attention and ordered the troops to continue advancing. They quickly dealt with the remaining attacking believers, and Brian led a squad of soldiers into the church, swiftly eliminating the resistance inside. Afterward, they began searching the church according to His Majesty's orders. All documents, letters, and supplies were meticulously seized. When they finally opened the thick iron door to the basement, they saw that it was filled with boxes, and inside the boxes were piles of gold coins and stone of God punishments. Meanwhile, in Slumbering Isle, the gray clouds hung low, mirroring Heidi Morgan's heavy heart. Amidst the flashes of lightning and the roars of thunder, her thoughts became increasingly chaotic. It had been over 2 months since Iffy and Shadowfeather left, and there had been no word from them, leaving her feeling puzzled and anxious. If the distance was the issue, they could have easily threatened Honey and forced her animal messengers to send a message. Heidi couldn't help but wonder what kind of accident had happened. Agitated, she closed the window, blocking out the howling sea wind. The situation on Slumbering Isle was gradually turning against her. Since Tilly's return, the non-combat witches had all sided with her, putting Heidi under tremendous pressure. These witches, usually weak and powerless, were now rapidly rising in status, and there were even signs of them confronting the combat witches. Just then, a red-haired woman hurried in, her voice anxious, bringing bad news. As Heidi's most loyal assistant, she rarely showed such a flustered demeanor, which made Heidi feel somewhat uneasy. The woman reported, "A new witch has come to Slumbering Isle, her name is Annie." After hearing this, Heidi remained indifferent. Saying new witches arrived frequently, and she didn't think much of it. However, the red-haired woman earnestly added, saying she had seen her before, Annie was from the Wolfheart Kingdom. Heidi's heart skipped a beat, quickly realizing that this new witch might be a witch rejected by the Blood Fawn. A trace of unease rose in her heart, she asked if it was just a coincidence of the same name. The red-haired woman shook her head. Although she wasn't entirely certain at first, after seeing Annie with her own eyes, she was convinced that it was indeed Annie from years ago. Her impression of Annie was exceptionally deep because the witch who had accompanied Annie back then was iffy. After hearing this, Heidi abruptly grabbed the woman's collar, questioning her if she had let Annie go. The woman quickly denied it, emphasizing that she had acted strictly according to Heidi's instructions. Heidi stared into her eyes, searching for any traces of lying. After a while, she slowly let go and calmly asked for the details of the situation. The woman took a deep breath and explained that Annie was ill, and her condition seemed quite serious. Heidi pondered for a moment, then ordered the woman to bring Nightfall over and also tell Shaji to have a look, since Annie had never seen Shaji before. Outside, the rain poured down heavily, the dense raindrops beating against the window, creating a dull sound. Heidi sat silently at the table, the atmosphere in the room oppressively tense, while the other two stood by, quietly waiting for her instructions. Suddenly, there were hurried footsteps outside the door. The door opened and closed, and Shaji returned to report that Annie was asleep. However, it seems like Annie's condition was not very optimistic. The cold plague had invaded her lungs, and it seemed that the disease had persisted for some time. Heidi's face darkened, and she asked in a cold tone, questioning what was Camilla planning to do? Shaji answered that Camilla planned to send Annie to a border town in the Western Territory. Heidi immediately realized that once Annie went to the western regions and met up with Iffy, everything Heidi had done could be exposed, which was absolutely unacceptable to her. Heidi suppressed her anger and turned to Nightfall, speaking in a cold voice, questioning if Nightfall could ensure that Annie stays asleep forever. Nightfall hesitated slightly and answered that although she could do it with her ability seed of peaceful death, she didn't understand why it was necessary. Heidi impatiently interrupted her, saying Annie is a traitor to the Blood Fawn, and Nightfall doesn't need to know the specific reasons. Nightfall was not convinced and seemed very confused. She asked why not wait for Tilly to come back and decide? The consequences could be unimaginable if someone found out about it. A dangerous glint flashed in Heidi's eyes as she slammed the table, asking if Nightfall was trying to defy her will? With a slight tremble in her body, Nightfall eventually acquiesced to Heidi's request, assuring that she would listen to Heidi's command. Seeing this, a subtle smile played across Heidi's lips. She further inquired if Nightfall could control the timing of her powers, specifically requesting that her abilities take effect right after Annie is put on the boat. Although hesitant, Nightingale eventually nodded in agreement. Pleased, Heidi decided it was time to pay a visit to Annie. Accompanied by the Blood Fawn members, Heidi found Camilla sitting outside of Annie's room. With a tone of concern, Heidi expressed that they had heard about a witch from Wolfheart Kingdom and wanted to check on her condition. Camilla tried to dissuade them, explaining that Annie was already asleep and should not be disturbed. However, Heidi's patience was wearing thin. With a threat in her tone, she directly stated that she was familiar with the name and suggested that perhaps they knew this witch. Faced with Heidi's persistence, Camilla appeared somewhat frightened and eventually, albeit reluctantly, led them inside the room. Heidi looked disdainfully at Camilla, almost deciding on the spot to give her some beating. As she walked into the room, she signaled to Sky Flame. The red-haired woman carefully observed the girl lying on the bed with her eyes tightly closed, giving an almost imperceptible nod. Heidi approached Camilla, lowering her voice to inquire about Annie's condition. Though she appeared concerned, her real intention was to block Camilla's line of sight. As Nightfall prepared to use her powers, Camilla did not answer Heidi but instead displayed a strange expression. Camilla then held onto Nightfall's arms and asked why she wanted to kill Annie. Heidi was slightly shocked, and before she could react, Annie, who was lying on the bed, had already disappeared. Watching Nightfall get ready to use the seed of peaceful death, Camilla was heartbroken. She had always thought Nightfall would never do such a thing. Camilla then glanced at her, calling her a murderer. Unable to suppress her rage any longer, Heidi unleashed her magical ability towards Camilla. The moment Camilla was struck, her figure dissipated into a cloud of white mist. Just then, Heidi understood everything. She shouted loudly, "Shadow! It's you!" Footsteps hurriedly echoed through the corridor as Shadow started to flee at full speed. Heidi commanded Skyflame to catch Shadow. Using her ability, the flames quickly caught up to Shadow and a distant scream was heard. The three of them immediately started to run, fleeing from the palace. Just as they arrived at the front gate, they abruptly stopped in their tracks. In the pouring rain, Ashes held her great sword in the garden, exerting immense pressure on the trio just by standing there. Heidi turned her head to the side and saw two familiar figures at the entrance of the palace, Andrea and Shadow. Shadow was playfully sticking out her tongue and making faces at them, clearly pretending during the previous scream. Heidi then realized that Tilly had never left the slumbering isle. Heidi's heart sank completely. Ashes coldly looked at them, telling them there was no need for explanations, and if they surrendered, she would spare them. Heidi looked at Ashes, knowing she wasn't bluffing. However, she didn't believe everything was over. She commanded Skyflame to hold Ashes back while she and Nightfall ran towards the palace entrance. Heidi ordered Nightfall to deal with Shadow first, and then keep Andrea as a hostage. But Andrea calmly raised the long iron rod in her hand. Before Heidi could see what was happening, a booming sound completely paralyzed her body. She fell hard to the ground, stumbling and collapsing into the rainwater, the splashing water pouring into her mouth, nose, and clothes. Without checking her injuries, she hoarsely yelled for Nightfall to attack Andrea. However, Nightfall's response left her utterly disappointed. Nightfall didn't attack Andrea and ultimately returned to Heidi's side to check on her injuries. Struggling, Heidi lifted her head and saw Andrea slowly walking towards her, asking if she still wanted to resist. Nightfall answered for her, surrendering and pleading for Andrea not to kill Heidi. Andrea looked coldly at Heidi, telling her that Tilly still has some questions she wants to clear up. She'll wait until the evidence is conclusive before deciding Heidi's fate. So for now, they are safe. Nightfall, slightly bewildered upon hearing the word evidence, quickly interjected, saying Annie had betrayed the witches of the Blood Fawn, and that's why Heidi had to take action against her. Andrea glanced at Nightfall, now realizing that Heidi had deceived the members of the Blood Fawn. Shrugging, she clarified, Annie has never been a part of the Blood Fawn. Heidi knew she was in deep trouble, fully aware of what was coming next. Tilly must have gathered information on her from various sources. Seizing the moment Andrea turned her head, Heidi gritted her teeth and exerted the last of her strength to release her magical power, unleashing her ability, the power of shattering. "No, Lady Heidi!" Nightfall cried out. However, the ability did not take effect. An invisible barrier dissipated her ability. Heidi looked on in disbelief, while Andrea displayed a look of disgust. She reached for the Stone of God punishment necklace on her. After reporting the situation to Tilly, Ashes noticed that her expression was not as lighthearted or relieved as one might expect after resolving a major issue. Instead, she seemed somewhat distressed. Worriedly, Ashes asked if Tilly was feeling unwell. Tilly shook her head. She had initially been reluctant to believe the contents of Roland's secret letter. Her tone sounded quite melancholic as she expressed her inability to understand why, after the witches finally had a home of their own, they would still need to repeat the tragedies of the past. Ashes tried to comfort her, saying that Tilly had already done a great job. Not all combat witches would unconditionally agree with Heidi's methods, especially after their lives had improved. Some of them had already sided with them, and even members of the Blood Fawn were no exception. Tilly's mood still seemed low. She mentioned that since Heidi had indeed acted this way, she could no longer let her continue unchecked. However, according to Iffy, most of the witches from the Blood Fawn were unaware of this situation. She planned to gather everyone to clarify things, telling Ashes and Andrea not to treat them as enemies. She added that once the results were out, they would take Heidi to the border town. Ashes' voice filled with excitement at the mention of fighting against the church. Looking at Roland's letter, Tilly spoke in a solemn tone, to fight against the Judgment Army, the God Punishment Army, the Pure Ones, and even against the demons, just as Roland wrote in his letter. If they can completely crush the church, the witches will then be truly liberated. She looked at the two of them and asked if they were willing to go with her. Ashes replied without hesitation, saying she would always be by Tilly's side. Andrea also nodded in agreement. However, for some reason, the taste of ice cream sandwiches suddenly came to her mind. Roland was sitting in his office, listening intently to the intelligence being reported from the front lines. The voice from the magic seals reported that the drawbridge of Silver Light City had been lowered and they were advancing towards the church. Nightingale cautioned them to be careful. Roland spread out a map and checked for the location of Silver Light City, realizing that this was the maximum range of the magic seal. He noted that they would need to set up a relay station somewhere. Nightingale pointed out that they didn't have enough magic seals. There were only 4 pairs in total, and this operation had already used half of it. Capturing another demon was no easy task. Ever since obtaining the communication magic seals, many tasks have become more convenient. However, the communication magic seals had limited range. Similar to the tracking magic seals, its effect greatly weakened beyond a certain range. If 2 magic seals were too far apart, ensuring clear and stable voice transmission became difficult. Suddenly, the voice from the magic seals became distorted. Nightingale picked it up, asking what was happening. The voice from the other end came back, reporting that there was nothing left in the church, even the basement was empty. After a while, Roland expressed his frustration, realizing that the church had escaped. He lamented that he had been too cautious. Within the kingdom, no one could stand against the first army, and the nobles were not willing to face them head-on. However, that didn't mean that the opportunists among them wouldn't secretly send information to the church. If they had divided their forces and attacked 3 cities simultaneously from the start, they might have been able to catch them all. Nightingale comforted him, handing him a piece of dried fish jerky and insisting that being cautious was the right choice. If they had encountered a powerful pure one while the first army was divided up, they might have suffered heavy losses. Roland was momentarily stunned before taking the dried fish jerky, looking at Nightingale saying she's become quite good at comforting people. Nightingale smiled, asking if he was feeling a bit better. Suddenly, she appeared behind Roland, beginning to massage his shoulders, mentioning that Wendy had taught her this technique. As Roland enjoyed the massage, he commented that Wendy seemed to know a lot of things. Nightingale, with her eyes closed, agreed, saying that during the arduous journey of the Witch Association times, when they were enduring all sorts of hardships, it was Wendy who had stabilized the team. Otherwise, given Hakira's temper, she would have driven everyone away a long time ago. Nightingale stated that when it came to taking care of the sisters, no one did it better than Wendy. While enjoying the massage, Roland was again interrupted by the sound of the magic seals. This time, the voice was crystal clear, as if someone was shouting right into his ear. It was Lightning, reporting that the red mist behind the snow mountain had disappeared, or more accurately, was disappearing. Maisie, who was with her, confirmed Lightning's observation. Roland, concerned about the adventurous spirit of the young girl, instructed them not to approach the demon's camp and to return immediately, fearing that provoking a high-ranking demon could lead to disaster. Both of them quickly responded and headed back towards the border town. "Get Agatha," Roland said to Nightingale. Agatha soon arrived at the office, but after carefully listening to Lightning's report, she was also somewhat puzzled. The Federation has rarely had the opportunity to approach the demon's rear camp. In the decades of fighting, they have never seen the demons retreat, she explained. In the end, Roland decided to continue observing the situation. Perhaps the red mist was only temporarily weakened. It was better to be cautious. He did not want to see any casualties at this critical moment. 5 days later, Lightning brought new information. The red mist behind the snow mountain had completely disappeared. After confirming that there were no signs of demon activity at the camp, a new reconnaissance team was quickly formed. Maisie, carrying Agatha, and Lightning took the lead, while several squads of soldiers escorted Soraya, Lien, and Summer, hoping to find out the reason behind the disappearance of the red mist. This was Agatha's first time approaching a demon's camp. Lightning reported that they had arrived and were about to descend, while Roland's voice came through the magic seals at the other end, instructing them to be careful and to immediately flee if they encountered any danger. Maisie closed her wings and dived towards the ground. The barren land was filled with black stone towers. Agatha pointed to the nearest black stone tower, observing that the tower had not withered. She speculated that the demons had not planned to retreat, or at least, the decision had been made very hastily. Just as they were about to head to the center of the camp, Lightning, who was walking in front, suddenly screamed and sank into the ground, startling Maisie into immediately transforming into a pigeon and taking to the air. Lightning quickly flew out of the hole. Angrily, she asked who had dug the hole there. Agatha was startled but relieved that Lightning was unharmed. Lightning discovered a demon in the hole, and upon inspection, Agatha confirmed that the demon was dead. She further affirmed her judgment that whatever had happened, whether it was a decision to retreat or some other emergency, it must have occurred very suddenly. The three of them continued forward. Ahead of them, the ground opened up into a huge hole. Lightning asked if they should explore it first, but Maisie and Agatha both said no at the same time. The little girl sighed, showing a look of regret. Ever since His Majesty had punished her to do the worksheets, her adventurous spirit had been much restrained. Leanne also hurried over, finding a narrow crack in the mountain. She carved a small path on the cliff just wide enough for one person to walk on, facilitating the transportation of leftover magic stones and equipment. Maisie transported the found items back to Border Town, while Summer also worked on tracing back the origins of the incident. Just then, Roland received a second secret letter from the fjords. The letter stated that Tilly was about to arrive in the Western Territory. The deep water port had not yet been completed. Nearby, there was only a simple dock and a few warehouses. "Is that big pit over there the collapsed shipyard from before?" Anna walked over to Roland, pointing to a location where a group of workers were busily working, and asked what they were doing. Roland felt slightly embarrassed. That was a construction accident. It resulted in injuries to 3 workers, but thankfully Nanawa was able to heal them all. He said he need to be more careful in future construction. Rem said a ship was coming, and Roland once again saw Tilly. He extended his right hand to her, and they shook hands with smiles on their faces. Even though they hadn't seen each other for several months, her demeanor was as if they had just parted yesterday, without any hint of unfamiliarity. Tilly mentioned that she had brought Heidi with her. Although Tilly had managed to subdue her, Heidi refused to disclose the whereabouts of the witches rejected by the Bloodfawn, insisting that she would only speak to Roland. Roland was taken aback for a moment. Tilly suggested that perhaps Heidi saw Roland as her last lifeline, thinking that if she offered Roland enough benefits, Roland might help her. Roland couldn't help but laugh, finding Tilly quite adorable when she was trying to give indirect hints, and asked if she was reminding him. He remarked that if he were really such a person, Tilly wouldn't have come to Border Town in the first place. Back at the castle, Andrea saw the letter. She commented that Otto was really a fool for daring to sneak into the palace at night with just 2 people. Ashes added that a big part of the incentive for their rash action was because of Andrea, at least it allowed them to be forewarned about the church's movements. Tilly asked if Roland had replied to Otto. Roland nodded while urged Otto not to act rashly since the enemy could be very powerful. He pointed out that they were too far from the Kingdom of Dawn, making it impossible for him to provide immediate help. They needed to keep a low profile and wait until the church turned its attention to Grey Castle before making any plans. Andrea, however, believed that Otto wouldn't listen to him, since Otto had always acted irrationally ever since a kid. Roland smiled, saying Otto would definitely listen because he had also written in the letter that Andrea was safe here in Border Town. Even if the church were to come, she would not be harmed. But if Otto and Oro were to die, they would never see Andrea again. Andrea was somewhat embarrassed, and Ashes commented with a smile that this was a very effective way to persuade someone like Otto. Tilly glared at Roland as if blaming him for teasing Andrea by revealing such personal matters. She then asked about Roland's plans to deal with the church. Roland shared recent strategic deployments, mentioning that the First Army had started to clear out the Church's influence within the kingdom and was beginning to station troops at Coldwind Ridge. He explained that this way, they wouldn't have to guess from where the enemy might attack, and the citizens of Grey Castle would be safe. Confronting the enemy head-on was also the First Army's preferred combat style. However, he admitted that the Pure One witches remained the biggest concern. Tilly placed a hand on Roland's shoulder, reassuring him not to worry, as that was the purpose of her visit. Smiling, she told Roland, "Don't worry, my brother. The witches of Slumbering Isle will stand and fight alongside you." Back at the witch's residence, Tilly went into the room she used to live in. Everything, from the living room to the bedroom, remained just as she left it, with not a speck of dust in sight. A clear sign that Roland had arranged for regular cleaning. Fresh food and fruits were also available. Ashes asked Tilly why she suddenly started calling Roland brother today, considering she had previously mentioned that Roland was different from the previous fourth prince. Tilly didn't feel whether it mattered. She turned to Ashes and asked her what this war meant to her. Without hesitation, Ashes responded, "Revenge." Tilly shook her head, asserting that it meant living a life of freedom. She took Ashes' hand and asked if she would like to live here. Ashes, surprised, simply stated that she would not leave Tilly. Tilly realized the misunderstanding and clarified with a smile that she just wanted to know whether Ashes liked this place. After a moment of hesitation, Ashes nodded, admitting that there was a reason the Witch Union witches were willing to serve Roland. However, they were different, they had their own homeland. Tilly interrupted her, explaining that there could be only 3 outcomes to this war. The first was that they couldn't withstand the assault of the God Punishment Army and they all perished in the northern territory of Grey Castle. If that happened, where they lived wouldn't matter anymore. Ashes quickly covered Tilly's mouth, insisting that such a thing would never happen and that she would swear on her life to prevent it. Tilly, with a teasing smile, said she was just making an assumption. Tilly then turned to discuss the second possibility: Roland might fail, but they could survive. She walked to the window, looking out at the vibrant castle garden, and continued that in such a scenario, Grey Castle would be unable to resist the church any longer, and the city of Neverwinter would be engulfed in flames. They would have only one place to go. They would continue to resist the church from Slumbering Isle until the Divine War. Ashes looked at Tilly, asking about the third possibility. Tilly, with a smile, said that it meant they would defeat the church, uproot Hermes, and liberate all the witches. When that day came, the mission of Slumbering Isle would also come to an end. Ashes was somewhat confused, and Tilly explained that Slumbering Isle originally served as a sanctuary for witches to hide from the outside world. Once the church was gone, they wouldn't need to conceal themselves on a fjord with a harsh living environment and scarce resources. Of course, it all depended on everyone's preferences, and they could choose where they wanted to live. Ashes nodded, stating that even if it was the demon-ridden abyss of hell, she would stay by Tilly's side. Tilly, with a playful smile, asked if Ashes would feel the same even in a world filled with nothing but salted fish and fish soup. Ashes was momentarily speechless. Tilly couldn't help but burst into laughter, saying they would definitely need to visit the city of Neverwinter often to change their diet. Andrea pushed open the door and peeked in, her head topped with a wooden basin. She asked what they were talking about and invited Tilly to join her for a bath. Tilly nodded, and Ashes said she would join as well, earning a glare from Andrea. Watching the two exchange looks, Tilly couldn't help but feel at ease, thinking that if they really could defeat the church, everyone could live days like these. Roland was lost in thought for a while in the office, and Nightingale, munching on some dried fish jerky, asked him why he had such a big reaction. She teased, "It's just Tilly calling him brother. If Roland likes, Nightingale can call him that as well." Roland was caught off guard by Tilly calling him brother on the docks. Before their last farewell, Tilly had never acknowledged their sibling relationship. After hearing Nightingale, Roland thought to himself that although Nightingale was slightly older than him, the idea of Nightingale calling him brother seemed quite nice too. However, he immediately shook his head, realizing this line of thought was dangerous. Roland asked Nightingale why Tilly had suddenly changed her attitude. Nightingale, looking at her small fish jerky, speculated that it might be because Roland did not take advantage of the Bloodfang's attempt to divide Slumbering Isle, and quickly went to full-scale war with the church. Or maybe Tilly had just slipped up accidentally calling him brother. Roland sighed. None of this really mattered. Regardless of the reason, this would make their relationship even closer, marking a solid step forward in his efforts to win over all the witches of Slumbering Isle. The two of them left the castle and headed to the dungeon. To ensure Nanoa's safety, Nightingale had knocked out Heidi before treating her. Nightingale mentioned that Heidi had even tried to take Andrea hostage at the time. Roland nodded, agreeing that Nightingale did the right thing. He then asked her to wake Heidi up. Nightingale nodded, flashed into the cage, lifted Heidi up, and brought her to the bars. Heidi opened her eyes, and Roland, looking down at her from above, said, "He is Roland Wimbledon, the king of Grey Castle. If Heidi has something to say, speak now." Roland asked Heidi where the witches she had rejected had gone. Heidi didn't answer directly but instead asked if Iffy had told him about it. Roland nodded, informing Heidi that Annie, the witch she tried to kill earlier, was Iffy's friend. He then questioned why Heidi, as a noble of high status, with royal lineage, didn't keep all the witches. She surely could afford to provide for a dozen or so support witches. Even if their abilities were of no use to her, she would only need to provide them with some food. Moreover, the support of witches was much more useful than Heidi could imagine. Heidi clenched her teeth and remained silent, but Roland saw a strong hatred in her eyes. After a while, she scoffed, accusing Roland of merely using the witches for his own benefit, and that's how he won Grey Castle. Roland shook his head. Perhaps Heidi thought that he relied on the witches to conquer the kingdom and become the king? He didn't want to explain too much and asked again where the witches had gone. Heidi didn't look at Roland and just said that she had released them to find other witch organizations on their own. Before she could finish her sentence, Nightingale directly interrupted, asserting that everything Heidi said was a lie. Heidi, not knowing who the blonde woman was, panicked when she saw Roland turn to leave. She kept shouting "Your Majesty" and insisted that Nightingale knew nothing. Roland didn't even want to look at her and just told her that Nightingale could discern lies and that Heidi should know why she had been brought here for interrogation. Under the dim firelight, Heidi's expression was shifting, and it was clear that she hadn't expected a witch to possess such an ability. After a brief silence, she suddenly grabbed the iron bars and loudly declared that the Wolfheart Kingdom had been annexed by the church. She claimed to be the last member of the royal family and promised Roland countless benefits if he helped her reclaim Wolfheart. She offered gold, jewels, witches, and even herself to Roland. The Bloodfang would also listen to Roland. He could have half of Wolfheart if he wanted. Roland demanded her to shut up, insisting that he only wanted to know the whereabouts of the witches. Heidi incredulously asked if what she had offered wasn't worth more than those witches. Roland felt a growing sense of annoyance. He was questioning Heidi out of basic noble courtesy, but he had many other ways to make her speak. Heidi should be no stranger to torture. Roland asked again, where exactly were the witches? Heidi looked at Roland and asked if he would let her go if she told the truth. Roland assured her that he always kept his word. Grasping at this lifeline, Heidi hesitated for a long time before finally saying, she handed them over to the nobles. Nightingale confirmed that she was telling the truth this time. Heidi explained that she had used the reputation of the Bloodfang Association to attract more witches to join her, then traded them to the nobles. These nobles, who now privately held witches, were also willing to help Heidi avoid the church. Roland clenched his fist and could imagine what had happened to these witches without needing to ask. Both Roland and Nightingale were furious, but they restrained themselves. Heidi had never met Annie. Skyflame had, but Skyflame had already been killed by Ashes. The other witches in the Bloodfang were unaware of Heidi's actions. Heidi looked at her hands and said that she had originally wanted to help her father ascend to the throne that rightfully belonged to him. She didn't continue, but Roland already understood the outcome. After Duke Morgan's death, the Bloodfang became a tool for Heidi to realize her own desires for power. After leaving the dungeon, Nightingale couldn't help but grab Roland's hand, asking if he was really going to spare the life of that murderer. Roland coldly replied that Heidi Morgan was a witch from the Slumbering Isle, and he would not deal with her. Whether Slumbering Isle would let her go was not something for Roland to decide. The next day, Roland shared this news with Tilly and the others. Ashes was furious and wanted to kill Heidi in the dungeon immediately. Roland recounted in detail what had happened in the dungeon and told Tilly that Nightingale had already confirmed the truth. He had not expected to get the results so quickly. Heidi was more fragile than he had thought. Tilly looked somewhat downcast, but she still thanked Roland for what he had done. Seizing the opportunity, Roland said that he was, after all, Tilly's brother, so there was no need for formalities. How to deal with the situation was now up to Tilly. Tilly was silent for a while, then asked how Roland would handle this if it happened in the city of Neverwinter. Roland looked into her eyes and saw a hint of sorrow and regret, but more so, silent anger. Clearly, Tilly had made her decision. Roland comforted her, saying he would do the same as Tilly. Tilly nodded, then she and Ashes stood up and decided to leave. Suddenly, the communication magic seal was activated. It was lightning. She said that Summer had already found the exact time of the event. Roland asked what had happened.